I think we're ready, Dave. Good morning. I'd like to welcome everyone to the Bible class here this morning at Otisville. A lot of visiting going on that side. Take your time, we're here for you. It's good to see everybody talking and visiting with each other. That's one of the things that we encourage here at Otisville, so we're glad that's happening. Are there any prayer requests before we begin this morning? Will you bow with me as we pray? Father in heaven, we're so grateful for this morning that you've seen fit to give us a time which we can open your word and study it and become better servants of thee. Father, we know we have a number of our family and friends who are struggling with illnesses and who are sick and going to be undergoing operations. We ask that you extend your healing hand and restore their health and be with the doctors that are performing these surgeries. Father, we ask that you be with Andrea. She's contracted COVID, so be with her that the symptoms won't be that strong and things will be well for her and she'll get over this very, very quickly. Be with us throughout this morning in Jesus' name. Amen. We're in Daniel chapter 5. We got through roughly verse 6 last week. But for those who might not have been here, a little bit of recap. We know that Nebuchadnezzar was king, but as we start off in chapter 5, Belshazzar is now king. And then we went through who he is. So after Nebuchadnezzar, his son took over, Emil Marduk. He was killed by his brother-in-law. He took over for a little while, and then he was murdered for somebody else. He ran it. He was in office for a little bit. And then Nabonidus, he served from 556 to 553. And then his son, Belshazzar, is the one that's taking over. And as we're reading through Daniel, when it refers to Nebuchadnezzar and then Belshazzar, it says, he's talking to Nebuchadnezzar saying, your father. But as I explained last week, that could mean a descendant of, and as we look through, that Belshazzar's father was Nabonidus, however you pronounce his name there. So he is actually Nebuchadnezzar's grandson. That's who Belshazzar is. That's the lineage going down through that. And that's why we see, you might see somebody think it's a discrepancy where it says, hey, he's your father. But back in those days, it could mean a descendant, somebody of, and that's how we come up with he is Nebuchadnezzar's grandson. And as we pick up in verse 6 of chapter 5, we know that Belshazzar had a dream, kind of like what his grandfather did, another dream of what's going on. Let me rephrase that. He saw writing on the wall. He didn't have a dream. But he is having this feast that he planned. And during this feast, he had all these gold vessels that Nebuchadnezzar captured from Jerusalem when he captured them. But Nebuchadnezzar had some respect for them, and he left them in the temple of his gods. But Belshazzar pulled these out and used these golden vessels that were from Jerusalem in his little drunken feast here that he had put on. And he was drinking and praising his own gods, his pagan gods, while drinking through some of these things. And then while this was going on, this finger and this man's hand appeared and started writing words on the wall, and that's where we're picking up right here. And it's noted that as the writing was going on, it was opposite the lampstand. So this hand was purely visible to everybody. And it's noted in Daniel that the king saw this. So there's no discrepancy that it wasn't somebody that drank too much saw this, because after the fact, the writing was still there on the wall. And, later we'll see that Daniel comes in, but this wasn't anybody's imagination, this writing that went on the wall. It really happened, and it was there for everybody to see. So we're going to be picking up in verse 6 here. Any questions with that quick recap or anything that we've talked about these past few weeks? I mean, I'll even go back to chapter 1 if you have a question. Okay, in verse 6, I'm going to read verses 6 through 9 so we can pick back up where we are. I'm in Daniel chapter 5. And the king's face grew pale, and his thoughts alarmed him, and his hip joints went slack, and his knees began knocking. The king called aloud to bring the conjurers, the Chaldeans, the diviners. And the king spoke and said to the wise men of Babylon, any man who can read this inscription and explain its interpretation to me will be clothed with purple, have a necklace of gold around his neck, and have authority as the third ruler in the kingdom. I will come back to this third ruler of the kingdom in a little bit. And all the king's wise men came in, but they could not read the inscription or make known its interpretation to the king. Then King Belshazzar was greatly alarmed, and his face grew even paler, and his nobles were perplexed. When Nebuchadnezzar had his dream, first one he was kind of afraid, the next one first one he's losing sleep, the next one he is pretty afraid. Belshazzar, when he's seeing this writing here, he is very alarmed. They could see his face grew pale. You could see a change in the color of his face. Have you ever seen somebody, they've been told information or something, and you can just see the color go right out of their face? That's what's happening to him here. And his hip joints went slack, and his knees began knocking together. So you could physically see how much this alarmed this man. You could see the change of the look in his face. His body was shaking. His knees were knocking. So you can see that this was really alarming him because of what was going on. Well, it was the fact that this hand appeared out of nowhere writing these words, and all of a sudden these words, he didn't know what they were, and he didn't know what they meant. So it's quite a sight there that this was happening. And there was 1,000 people at this event as well. These people are seeing this all go on, and these people are also seeing the king's reaction. So it's going through their mind of what's going on with the king, what's going on with this writing. So it had to be quite an event of what's happening here. And remember, these people had too much to drink as well. They felt the effects of some of the things that they were drinking, but still this was quite a shock to them of what was going on. And the king was pretty much scared. I don't want to say scared to death of this handwriting, but it really, really physically affected him by the response that he was given. And of course, he didn't understand it. So what does he do? Like his grandfather. Let me call in these wise people. Let me call in the Chaldeans, the diviners. Let me call in the people who are under me that can tell me what this says, that tell me what this means. And with the events that we heard with Nebuchadnezzar, did that work out? Did these people help Nebuchadnezzar at all? None of them could tell him what his dreams were. None of them could tell him what the interpretations were. They were a resource for him, but they could not help Nebuchadnezzar at all during his time of dreams and that. Same thing's going on here with Belshazzar. They cannot interpret what these words are, but he brings them in anyhow. He's hoping that they're going to answer this. He's hoping they can tell him what this means because it's really affecting him. But he brings them in. And what does he do like Nebuchadnezzar? You tell me what this says, I will give you some gold. I will make you a purple robe. I'll put this necklace around you. I will put you in charge. You tell me this, I will give you something. These people work for him. It should be, tell me what it says. Why is he giving these people these extra riches, all these extra things? Like Nebuchadnezzar. When you go do a job for your boss, he says, I want you to solve this for me. Did you say, you solve this for me, I'll make you the CEO, I will give you a bonus, I will give you a raise. No, do your job and solve this. But these people who have all this power, all this pride, all this authority, are doing these things. You solve this, you tell me what these words mean, you tell me the interpretation, I'll give you a purple robe. I'll put a gold necklace around you. I'll put you third ruler in charge here. What verse was that where it said third ruler? 7, thank you. Why is third ruler important? As I said, Belshazzar is king. That's a true-ish statement. His father was still king, Nabonidus, but he was not in the capital of Babylon. He went out near the Tigris-Euphrates River. He was heavily into worshiping the god called Sin, who was the god of the moon. He was very heavy into worshiping him. He was out in that area near the Tigris and Euphrates River, in Sippa and all that. And he was doing a lot of excavating, restoring some temples and doing things out there and building things up. But he was worshiping heavily the god of sin. So he was out of the capital of Babylon. And so he basically said, son, run this. So Belshazzar's father was still king, but he was taking a back role doing what he wanted to do. He wanted to worship the god Sin and do all this excavating and do all these restoring areas. And he was letting his son Belshazzar run Babylon through the capital. So it's kind of dual kingship, but who was really running Babylon was Belshazzar. So the official chain of command was his father, number one, him, number two, and he was going to make the next person number three, which would be right under him. So if you look at it in the capital of Babylon, Belshazzar would have been ruler number one, and who could ever answer this would be ruler number two. That's the power that he was given this person who can interpret, read what these words were, and tell him what it meant. So it was quite a high position of power that this person would be given if they could respond and answer what these words were. So quite a bonus for doing your job, what you're supposed to be doing, by becoming second in charge. It's saying third ruler, but second in charge of the capital of Babylon. Even though there's one higher, but he's out of pocket doing his own thing, but you'd be right under the king of the capital of Babylon. So the wise men come in just like they did in Babylon, going down to verse 8. They come in like they did for Nebuchadnezzar, and they couldn't read the writing. They couldn't interpret what it said. And we saw this with Nebuchadnezzar. They couldn't do it. When God does something, he's always in control. And this handwriting had to be coming from God. And if God wanted Belshazzar to know what it meant, if he wanted his wise men to know what it meant, he would have let them know it. But they didn't. And there's a reason for that. And we see in going down to verse 8 and verse 9 that they couldn't read it. But this alarmed the king even more. Had he not heard of Daniel? Yes, he's several generations away, roughly 30, 40 years from when Nebuchadnezzar stopped reigning. Had he not heard of what happened to Nebuchadnezzar and some of the things that happened to him? Had Belshazzar not heard some of the things that Daniel did? We don't know. But it seems like he would have heard some of these things. But we don't know for sure. And by the wise men not being able to read the writing, interpret it, this is really alarming Belshazzar. So I don't know if in the back of his mind he heard some of these things and couldn't get it answered, but he could not answer these questions. And the wise men were even confused. They were confused at the king being so upset, so alarmed, or these wise men so perplexed because they can't answer this question. They can't read this writing. They can't do the interpretation for the king. Yes, Bill?
So, as we look at that, he's falling back into the same traditions that his grandfather was in. You kept saying as his grandfather,
Yes.
as his grandfather. He kept falling into one reason he did it because that's what they always did, that was tradition. And I think that we also need to be careful, as we talk about how this relates to us, we need to be careful on how we think of things and worship things and just not keep the traditions of our fathers and our grandfathers. I think back to the Wednesday night class when we talked about the week of the Passion and a different way to think of that. And all of a sudden it's like, yeah, we need to always be searching for the truth and not fall back on the traditions and study and make sure that we know what we're doing.
Follow the truth, not the traditions. Absolutely. I actually read this within the last week. It goes along with what Bill said. This little story, cute story. This daughter asked her mom, how come you always cut the end of the sausage before you cook it? She goes, well, that's what your grandma did. So the next few days, they go see Grandma. Grandma, why did you cut the ends of the sausage off before you cook it? She says, well, my mom told me she cut the ends of the sausage off because that's how they fit in the pan. So it had nothing to do with making the sausage taste better. They followed tradition and lost this much sausage each time. But like Bill's saying, we got to be careful not to follow these traditions, cut the end of the sausage off, and lose some of the important information that the Bible's telling us, and because we're following what tradition has done in our family, in our congregation, or whatever, we need to make sure that we're always following the truth. Terry?
Yeah, in this same chapter, verse 22, Daniel was going to say to Belshazzar, and I hate to jump ahead, but he says Belshazzar knew about what happened with his grandfather. He says the words, you, his son Belshazzar, having not humbled your heart, even though you knew all this.
Yep.
The all this was how God sent Nebuchadnezzar out to be like an animal for years.
That we see the end of
He tells him,
Nebuchadnezzar.
you
Yep.
knew all this, but you did not humble your heart. It wasn't
Absolutely.
a case of tradition, it was a case of stubbornness and wanting your own way.
You kind of went ahead there.
Yeah, I know.
But no, you're absolutely right. And it wasn't been a point I made that he knew it. I mean, I said that how much did he know, didn't he know of what his grandfather? We can only assume so much until we read it, and we said we knew. But how much did he know? But he knew enough that he was doing wrong. And he knew enough about what happened to his grandfather that his grandfather did wrong, and how his grandfather turned and all of a sudden did wrong again. So it's what do we know and what do we follow? That's Mark.
Yeah. They couldn't interpret the writing. Was it because was it in like a different language, or was it like a riddle that they couldn't interpret the riddle? Or
Good question. Because God didn't want him to read it. That's the only answer I got for you, Mark. I don't know what language it was in. From what I've read, it's similar to Aramaic, but it didn't say that it was Aramaic. So I don't know what language it was, but it was to the point. It's when we get down there, because you brought this up, I'll ruin it for everybody, Mark. It's just 4 words. 4 words is what was written. So it's not like it's a big old phrase or anything. It's just 4 words that are written. But nobody could read what the words were or interpret it. And there was a reason for that. God wanted the reason to be for Daniel to come in and tell what the words were in the interpretation. So what
May not have been a language.
it just
Because all the wise men, you would think that
they would understand
they
it.
have to know some kind of written language or something like that, so maybe it was written in a heavenly language or like, riddle or.
We know what the words are spelled out, and I'm going to have trouble pronouncing them, but they could not read them and understand them. Which, remember, at this feast there was 1,000 people there. Well, if somebody knew what it was, the guy in the back would have raised in, I know what it means. No, didn't have that. And these wise men under his counsel couldn't read what the words were. So, but I can't say it was this language. I can't say it was Arabic. I can't say it was Chaldean. It was a language that nobody knew what the words were.
they didn't have Google back then.
They did not have Google back then. No, Wi-Fi did not exist. So, anything else before we go on? All great comments on this. I mean, it really gets us thinking. As I appreciate Bill bringing up the point that following tradition. That's I thought about it a little bit, but that makes so much sense. How much tradition do we follow? And when we, it's close, but it might not be spot on to the point of what we should be following. So.
And you mentioned in that there's nothing wrong with following tradition as long as the tradition is based on truth.
Absolutely.
I mean, if it's true, it's okay to do that. We don't need to throw away just because it's tradition, but we need to make sure that what we're doing is consistent with what the Bible teaches us we should be doing.
Yes, and that is the most important thing. Following what the Bible is saying we should be doing. If we've adopted that, so to speak, as tradition, fantastic. But don't make what we want as tradition and follow it versus what God did. And we see Nebuchadnezzar did what he wanted to do versus what God wanted him to do, and we saw that where that got him. Anything else? Great comments, folks. Tess asked me if it was going to be a good class today. I says it all depends on you guys, and so far it's a good class. I appreciate that. Let's continue on. We know what they saw. Well, we know that they saw something, and they're petrified about it. So let's see what happens in verses 10 through 12. The queen entered the banquet hall because of the words of the king and his nobles, and the queen spoke and said, "O king, live forever. Do not let your thoughts alarm you or your face be pale. There is a man in your kingdom in whom the spirit of the holy gods, and in the days of your father, illumination, insight, and wisdom, like the wisdom of the gods, were found in him. And King Nebuchadnezzar, your father the king, appointed him chief of the magicians, conjurers, Chaldeans, and diviners. This was because an extraordinary spirit, knowledge, and insight, interpretation of dreams, explanation of enigmas, and solving of difficult problems were found in this Daniel, whom the king named Belshazzar. Let Daniel now be summoned, and he will declare the interpretation." Interesting. The queen comes in. Now, from what I've read and found, the queen was not Belshazzar's wife, because we saw earlier on in verse 2 that Belshazzar's wives were already there. It's believed that this queen was his father's wife, and so it would be his mother, mother-in-law, whichever. I don't know how many wives he had, but she was one up, and she's the one that's coming in explaining this to him, because Belshazzar already had all his wives and concubines in there, as we saw in verse 2, but she's the one coming out, and it kind of makes a little bit of sense. She would be a little bit older. She would have been around a little bit more with some of the things that happened on with Nebuchadnezzar and Daniel, and know a little bit more and have a little more insight on that. But she comes out and, like everybody else, greets the king. "O king, live forever." Basically, "Hey, king, how you doing?" It's one of those greetings of honor, but they do every time that they see him, whether you like the king or not. And now some versions out there said that will say who came out was the king's mother, but as I read in verse, where was it at? In verse 11, it said, "And King Nebuchadnezzar, your father, and your father the king." Sometimes these words, instead of fathers, means descendant, like Nebuchadnezzar, your father, Nebuchadnezzar, your descendant, Nebuchadnezzar, your grandfather, and the king, your father, who's the guy out doing his own thing right now. This is saying queen, your mother. It could be your grandmother at that point. So now that he's been explained that, let Daniel come in, which, as Terry let us know, in verse 22, I believe it is, he knew all this. Belshazzar knew all these things that what his grandfather did. He had to know a little bit about Daniel. Did he know the full story of Daniel? We don't know. But he had to have some knowledge of Daniel. It might have been to the point where this guy's just a Jew. I believe nothing he is. He was taken into captive. He might not have any trust or any insight of Daniel, but he had to have heard of him at some point. But he's reminded by the queen, by his mother, that there's this guy, he interprets dreams. And as we go on, we'll, in verse 12, at the very end, she says, he will, not he can, he will declare the interpretation. She has all the confidence that Daniel will do it. So she has to have a lot more insight on Daniel and what Daniel believes in, because she's really, really building Daniel up here. She's saying, this is a guy, he's got all this insight, he's got all these problem-solving skills. He's the guy that can do this for you. And she really builds it up and ends by saying, he will be the one that will declare this interpretation to you. So she trusts of what Daniel knows. Whether she truly believes that Daniel's God is the one that's going to be helping him out here, we don't know that. But she knows that Daniel is the one who can do it because he has done it before. Any questions? Oh, now you've gone silent. So, okay. But it's interesting that Belshazzar has this party and this feast, and he sees his handwriting and he gets afraid. And then what does it do? I mean, when you get afraid, I don't care how old you are. Mom can calm you down. Mom can make you feel good. So mom comes out, grandma comes out and says, there's this guy that can take care of this for you. There's this guy that can answer your questions. And what are we supposed to do? We're supposed to listen to mom and grandma, aren't we? So Belshazzar, verse 13, let's see what he does here. Verses 13 through 16. Then Daniel was brought in. He listened to mom and grandma there. He listened to grandma. And Daniel was brought in before the king. The king spoke and said to Daniel, "Are you that Daniel who was one of the exiles from Judah, whom my father the king brought in from Judah? Now I've heard about you, that the spirit of the gods is in you, and that illumination, insight, and extraordinary wisdom has been found in you. Just now the wise men and the conjurers were brought in before me, that they might read this inscription and make its interpretation known to me. But they could not declare the interpretation of the message. But I personally have heard about you, that you were able to give interpretations and solve difficult problems. Now, if you are able to read the inscription and make its interpretation known to me, you will be clothed with purple and wear a necklace of gold around your neck, and you will have authority as the third ruler in the kingdom." He calls in Daniel. And just like all the other stories, Daniel's going to be able to solve this guy's problem. We don't see that here, but we know that Daniel's going to be able to solve the problems. But it's interesting how he talks to Daniel. If he's heard about Daniel, should he have known that Nebuchadnezzar renamed him, called him Belshazzar instead of Daniel? He named him after one of his pagan gods there. He doesn't address him as that. He addresses him as Daniel. But it also looks like he gets a little bit of a jab into him. "Are you that Daniel who was one of the exiles of Judah?" He didn't say, "Are you the Daniel that my grandfather put you in charge of all the wise men?" He didn't say that. "Are you that Daniel, the exile of Judah?" Sounds like he's reminding him of his lowly service, of his lowly position, kind of like intimidating him. "You're that lowly Jew who's in exile. That's who you are." Interesting how he's addressing him like that versus, "I need some information from you. You're the greatest thing since sliced bread. What does this mean?" But he doesn't do that. He's trying to put Daniel in his place to remind him who he really is in the king's mind, but yet he's relying on him to get this information from him. And he's relying on Daniel, who he's belittling right now, to get all this information to interpret this dream and tell him what the words are. So I thought it was interesting that he called him in like that and treated Daniel with very little respect there. And in verse 14, the king repeats what he heard about Daniel, how he can do these things, how Daniel has this little bit of insight on reading things that other people can't do, how he can do some things that his wise men, that the king's wise men can't answer. But Daniel, you can do these things. He goes over all this and puts it in front of Daniel and tells him all that. And he says, "The spirit of the gods." Belshazzar left out the word holy, which the queen said, the spirit of the holy gods. No idea why Belshazzar did this. I mean, it might have been something to the simple fact that he's just an evil man and he doesn't want to give praise to God. Or, it could be something as simple that he was fearful of Daniel's God and he didn't want to show any disrespect or anything, so he says, "Let me just back off here and ease up a little bit." Don't know why he left out the word holy, but it's interesting that the queen said, "Spirit of the holy gods," but Belshazzar left it out. He might have left it out to disrespect God. We don't know, we can't read inside his mind, but it's interesting. The word holy was left out in this fact as he's talking to Daniel about the spirit of the holy gods is in you, and he left out the word holy. Verses 15 and 16, the king kind of briefed Daniel of the wise men couldn't read what it was. He says, "I've heard about you. I know what's going on with you." And then he goes, "You are able to give interpretations, and you can solve difficult problems. I've heard this about you." So is it the little bit he heard from the queen? Is it the little bit that he's known from the past? We don't know that. But he knows a little bit about Daniel, and he knows his reputation is is there of being able to solve issues, being able to interpret dreams, being able to solve problems. And now the king Belshazzar is relying on Daniel to do this for him. It kind of shows a little bit of respect for Daniel by him repeating what the challenge is that he once done, as far as reading the words and interpreting the dream that I've heard about you, here's what it is, now can you do it? So it kind of shows a little bit of respect for Daniel, but not a whole lot, because the king really doesn't care who interprets it. He just wants to know what do the words mean and what's its interpretation. Any questions? You folks need to be answering questions. I only brought notes for chapter 5 today. I did not bring notes for chapter 6. So we still got a lot of ground to cover. Yes, Brett?
You think these kings have been a little bit intimidated and afraid that there'd be a good chance if they didn't keep Daniel as a lowly figure, he could take over the kingship because he found great favor in God because he could interpret these dreams. All he'd have to do is convince the people that he could predict what was going to happen. I don't think it would have been too hard for him to overthrow the kingship. Maybe do you think maybe that's a
It's possible, but not probable. At the time, Babylon was starting to decline. It was the greatest empire under Nebuchadnezzar. But as it changed rulership throughout those 4 or 5 people, it did start to decline. But you still got to realize God's people are still captives. So they're not out there, they're not getting the best food, they're not being fed the best, they're not being treated the best, so they're still in captivity. Daniel, why he's kept around from ruler to ruler to ruler, God only has that question. He's the only one that knows that answer. Why they would do it, it seems like when one ruler comes in, I mean, look what happens in our government. One president comes in, he wipes out the cabinets and puts his people in. Why kings don't do that back then, don't know. Maybe he just kept Daniel around. He's not hurting anybody, he's not doing anything. But as far as Daniel being able to rally the troops, so to speak, to overthrow that, I don't think that would happen, because I think if any king got wind of anything like that, it would be, just off with his head.
yeah, I didn't really mean that he would do that, but they would maybe think that back of their head that they had to be careful how high they escalated him because he might have too much power over the people.
Well, Nebuchadnezzar put him in charge of all the wise men in the kingdom at that point. So he gave him quite a bit of authority there. And here, if Daniel could interpret it, the writings, he'll put him in third ruler, which would be just right under Belshazzar. So he doesn't seem too afraid of it, but there's potential there for that, of being afraid of what Daniel can do. But we've got to remember, all these kings, evil, pagan, don't worship God. So it's really like they don't really care about God or his people. So I don't know how much weight that would pull with Daniel in it, because the many things that Daniel interpreted for Nebuchadnezzar still failed and failed and failed. And we see, this is one of the end results of Nebuchadnezzar's failings. Yes, Tom?
Maybe this is a good place to ask this question. I've been noticing since we started this chapter how close Belshazzar and Belteshazzar are,
Yes.
the two names. And so I was just looking to see, is there any significance? And then based on what you said about maybe him not treating Daniel with a lot of respect, you can read on the internet, I don't know if
Yep.
it's true, but Belshazzar said means Baal protect the king.
Yes.
Belteshazzar, one writer said it was actually like a girl's name, Lady Protect the King. I don't know if that's it, but it went on to say anyway, it was like, one was almost seemingly, Belshazzar was an appeal to have their God protect the king. The other one was like a protector of the king. So I just wonder if maybe that has something to do with it from the standpoint that their names are so similar, but Daniel's name made him less also. So maybe, and then it's interesting that Belshazzar
he calls him Daniel.
which, you know, is kind of interesting because Daniel, I forget what it means, but it's like, in Hebrew, it has something to do with God, you know, kind of thing. I think it went to sleep here, so I can't tell you what it said.
I'm glad it went to sleep and not you. But I think in in week 1 I had what the name Daniel meant. I'll pull that back up. And but yes, the names are similar and the meanings are similar. But like you said, Daniel's is more of a lesser role, so to speak, in the names. But it was named after one of the gods, but not as like what Belshazzar is, which makes more sense because it's from the authority of people in power, how they want to name their kids after the gods that they worship, and like that. Like many of Nebuchadnezzar's had Marduk in the name, which was after one of their gods. They had other names with it, but it was Marduk something or something Marduk, named after their gods. Same with Belshazzar here of protect the king or protector of the king, like you mentioned. Okay.
So that's, you know, it made me think of it when you talked about maybe was there a little bit of disrespect or a lack of recognizing what he had done in the past, that maybe those names just like part of it.
I mean, this is a great sidebar you brought that up because it's interesting that who's interpreting these dreams and writings for the king? Daniel, and his name is God is my judge. I mean, God's in control here, and it's God is the judge of Nebuchadnezzar, of whose dreams are being, interpreted. God is the judge of Belshazzar, of what's going on right here at this particular point. So that's very interesting.
Representing how much he knew that God was the judge. He wasn't going to eat the food. He wasn't going to worship the idols. He wasn't going to do all this other stuff.
Yeah.
So Daniel has repeatedly given honor and glory to God, and they've kind of torn it down. And so Daniel has this opportunity once again to say, none of the people here can understand this or interpret it, but the God that I worship, the God of heaven and earth, he can do this.
Yeah.
So it's
Absolutely.
kind of interesting that, it's kind of like the Peter taught going both ways. They want to elevate their
You
God,
got-
and Daniel keeps going like,
No.
there's a God that needs to be elevated, but it's not these make-believe gods you worship, it's the God of heaven.
It's the God of heaven. And every time Daniel's brought in to do an interpretation or something, he glorifies God and gives God the glory before he does anything. So it's prevalent that God is in Daniel's life, and that's who he's following, no matter what's going on at this point in time of whatever's happened to Daniel or the situations. Bill.
So, Daniel, and on that point, Daniel even says later on, jump ahead, like Terry does, he doesn't take the gifts, he says,
Nope.
I don't want it. But, I don't know if you mentioned this tonight, you were talking about him being, disrespectful, and when,
The king being disrespectful. The king being disrespectful?
yeah,
Yes.
being disrespectful to Daniel, did you mention that, I know that you mentioned he didn't call him, he didn't say the holy God is with you.
Right.
But did you also mention that he says, if you can interpret this dream, when the queen says he will interpret the dream, did you mention that already?
No, I did not.
Okay.
Go ahead. You're doing fine.
I mean, that's another thing, he's just kind of
It's-
well, you can do this,
Yep. You're the exiled from Judea.
a little more disrespect. And I think Ken had a question.
Ken.
I didn't really have a question, I just had kind of a thought. It seems to me like, all the way through this, what are the Babylonians?
Yes, the Belshazzar and them, yes.
I feel like they are totally ignorant of the true God, and, no matter how much Daniel tries to convince them, it never gets through their head.
You're absolutely right, they are. But they've been shown many times who the true God is and what the true God does. I mean, it was brought to Nebuchadnezzar twice that it's the true God, the God of heaven, that puts people in power, that puts kings in power, that puts empires in reign. And it's this same God that pulls those same kings out of power and destroys empires. But yet, the people don't listen. They'll listen for a little bit that, yes, this is the true God because he answered this question for me, because he interpreted this for me. But then they go back to, as Bill said, they go back to their old habits. They go back to their old traditions, and they put God on the back burner. So,
They don't want to know.
That's a good way to put it. They don't want to know because they're happy with what they're doing at that time.
It's true today too, there's so many scientists and stuff that are out doing stuff, that there's proof out there, but they don't wanna know, they don't wanna accept it.
They don't want to acknowledge it
What reason why they don't want to accept it is, I'm sure it's a myriad of reasons, but,
because they have to admit they're wrong.
yeah.
Terry?
God tells us that if people search, they will find. They're just not searching.
It's unfortunate. Yes, Terry.
There were many different peoples, little nations that were all clumped together under Babylon.
Yes.
Some of them were large people, like we're gonna find out at the end of the chapter where it says the Medes. They were a sizable group, but there were a whole lots of them. And all of them had their own gods. Different names, different languages, and so forth. So, for example, two guys here, name starts with Bel. B-E-L was the name of a Babylonian god.
Yeah.
And for them to give that name to Daniel was an insult to him because that was their God that they put in his Aramaic name. Now, you say, like Daniel is God in it. Any Hebrew name that has the letters E-L, like Daniel has, that E-L is a shortened form of God.
Short for Elohim.
For what?
For Elohim. But they'll use the shortened form of it in a whole batch of Hebrew names. Anytime you ever in the Bible see the Hebrew name that has E-L in it, at the beginning, in the middle, or at the end, it's the name of, it's God. That's what that means, those two letters right there. So, getting back to, you talk about him, about them not knowing, this kingdom had hundreds of gods.
Yes.
And to them, Jehovah, or whatever, was the Jews' God, and that was a tiny little people over by the Mediterranean Sea. They didn't consider him that God important, even though it was something that happened to Nebuchadnezzar. And Belshazzar knew what happened to his grandfather. But as Daniel says to him, you didn't humble your heart. In fact, he says 2 or 3 times through the verses we're going to read. Verse 23.
Next week, we're going to read those.
But you have
So,
exalted yourself against the Lord of heaven. He's saying all these other gods are nobody, but none of you accept that. You just lump this God in with the batch, and then he's not so important to you.
that's what Nebuchadnezzar did. That's what Belshazzar did. They're lumping the God of heaven with all their pagan gods, and it's just one more on their list of many. Absolutely. But like you said, as you started quoting verses 22 and 23, that's, you haven't humbled your heart. We'll get into that next week. Not to cut you off, but that's next week, Terry. Any comments before we're done today? On this week's lesson, not next week's.
If you want kind of a little side note, nothing to do necessarily with the kind of class, but having to do with Belshazzar's feast. It's actually a pretty famous event among paintings and music.
The feast that Belshazzar had?
Belshazzar's feast is a painting that was painted in the 1600s. And it's also a katana that was written, I think, around 1930s, early 1930s. The only reason I know that second one is that Belshazzar's feast back in the 1970s was presented on stage at Wedding Auditorium, that entire katana. And Steve and I were actually part of the antiphonal brass part for that. And it is a really big ordeal sort of thing, with a full orchestra and a massive choir, and, all music and lyrics. And it was quite a thing to be a part of that. But, it's a fairly famous event simply because of how it's been presented in modern times.
Did not know that.
Yeah, we actually got the music the day before, didn't know what we were doing, and Steve and I and 3 of our friends were up in the right balcony, and there was another group of 5 people up in the left balcony, and we only had a very short part at one point through that, and luckily, they had to play first, and then we had to mimic them, because that's when we knew what to play as soon as they did that. So,
Okay.
you can ask Steve, that really happened.
Any other comments? See y'all next week. Thank you.